This is maybe one of the most ambitious topics I could have been asked to address, the evolution of the economy. I've sent out two papers that are the basis for this. Yeah. So anyone watching can go back and look at these two papers. The first, they're divided by 22 years. This paper on the world system under Asian hegemony was written in 1994 with the late Professor Andre Gunder Frank. And it was the basis for the initial draft of a book he later published in 1998 called Reorient, Global Economy in the Asian Age, which looked at these centuries in very great detail, but used our approach. The other one is the most recent essay on the future of development, or reinventing development, which has been published in a special issue of Development Forum. I'll refer to that later. So the first part of this talk, I mean, I have noticed we did work on what we call the 5,000-year-old world system. That we made the claim that a world economy and a world economic system had existed already for 5 millennia. Initially as an Afro-Eurasian nexus of exchange and accumulation, but eventually becoming global, of course, after the fusion in 1492. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk about fundaments of any theory of the economy. And that, I'll just go through some, I can't elaborate on them right now, but the elements that will have to be elaborated in detail and explored for their complexity. And that is the historical forms of value, use value, exchange value, symbolic value, and especially symbolic value, the forms of property in history, the historical forms, the historical forms of labor, including unfree labor and free labor forms, the forms of surplus or social surplus, and how those are created, the forms of exchange, whether that's reciprocity, market-based, household, gift. There are many forms of exchange. The market is an extraction. There are only historical markets, and they vary enormously with context. There are also the forms of the whole organization of political economy. So the extraction of surplus, social surplus, the distribution of the surplus, and the consumption and investment of the surplus are all fundamentals. There are also various types of complex. I wouldn't call them units, but complexes. The temple complex, the palace complex, the manorial complex, the household complex, various forms of oikos, or communal, solidaristic, no private property complexes. So there are also psychological complexes or mentalities, the most central of which I would call the accumulation complex, which is a kind of, we should try to demystify why human beings engage in activities of the sort of maximization of the accumulation of wealth to individuals or power elites. This is a fundamental question in global history. So I can't go into more detail on those. I'm just going to talk about some characteristics of the way we approach looking at the evolution of the world economy or the world system. And we emphasize more a structural approach and continuities in the structure. And that's not discounting transformative moments and evolutionary processes, of which I'm actually not going to emphasize too much in this section of the talk, but rather in the latter part, when we're looking at the future, the present and the future. But I'll just enumerate some of the structural characteristics which you find in our work. For example, it's a 1993 book with myself and Gunder Frank and many other contributors, which was called The World System 500 Years or 5,000, which was published by Routledge. And has been used by many other scholars since then, because we were part of a circle of correspondence of many scholars from that time who were coming together working on large-scale, long-term world history and a multidisciplinary perspective. So the first is the economy-polity contradiction, and that is that in the history of the world system, the economy of any particular polity is far greater in territorial extent than the authority or sovereignty of that polity. And this is a long-standing and continuing kind of structural tension that informs the structure of the system. Another pattern is hegemony, rivalry, alternations of pattern when it comes to the overall organization of the world system. So there are periods of relative hegemony, kind of stable hierarchy in power and wealth structure, and in the direction of flows to the apex of the hegemon, and also periods when that's not the case and there's competition and rivalry amongst multi-centers competing for advantage. These intersect with the historical state formation processes and the state system formation processes. So you can never separate the world economy from the parallel and very determining processes of state formation and interstate dynamics. It cannot really be separated at all, ever. I mean, this is the fundamental insight of political economy and international political economy versus the discipline of economics. So then we also recognize long cycles. We didn't discount the existence of Kondratiev since the 18th century, but Kondratiev waves, but we had a different estimation of long waves going back to the 3rd millennium BCE, which are more like 500-year patterns of long periods of expansion of the system and deepening its integration and so on, and then periods of sort of disaggregation or sort of connections and disconnections of these phases, and expansion and contraction phases, which were long cycles of several centuries each. And we actually mapped those, as I say, going back to the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE up to the present time. And that led us on to the idea of world system cycles, cycles of greater prosperity, stability, and cycles of crisis, or even general systemic crisis. The structure of the system has always been multicentric and multi-civilizational. It also has a center-periphery hinterland structure. And actually, my colleague and friend Philippe Bojard in Paris has published a magnum opus in French, 2-volume study of the Afro-Eurasian world system going back to the 4th millennium BCE, and he has a series of maps of every 2 centuries, which visually displays the changing nature of that structure. And also the central metropoles and the boundaries of the system are all there, and also the flow of commodities on both terrestrial trade routes and maritime trade routes. As I say, going back, his first chart is in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE. So Philippe Bojard the book is being translated into English and will be published by Cambridge University Press. But it's the first of its kind. Also, another element in the system is periodic center shifts. Notice the central locus or primary apex of the whole structure of the flows of wealth and power changes over time. So the center shifts and moves with the dynamism of the system over the centuries. But at the same time, the entire logistical nexus, the whole world economic system, never actually totally collapses or falls or does not exist. It reorganizes and rearticulates. Metropoles come, they go, they rise, they fall, trade routes change, the commodities in the trade routes change, but the whole structure itself continues. And that was a lesson we learned also from Abu Lughod, Janet Abu Lughod, her book Before European Hegemony, which looked at the 13th century, but actually all the way back to the 8th century. These were sort of pioneering works. That was published by Oxford in 1989. It was a prize-winning book, and she inspired us to start to work on this project. The world system as a whole also expands over time, and has been doing so for these millennia. Only now it has reached planetary limits. The world is saturated. The system has expanded to its terrestrial limit. Exchange relations, commodity production, and so on, these forms of social organization deepen and overtake more and more and more of the organization of social life, which again, we can see today, this is reaching its outer limit. Almost all human beings are now incorporated, you might say, into these social relations. There's the point about European hegemony, which is historical, which I'll just take you to. So Gunter Frank and I created this map, which was trying to summarize flows of commodities and flows of money, or bullion, silver and gold, over the centuries of the so-called rise of the West. But we made the hypothesis early on, it says in 1994, that actually the hegemony of Europe had been estimated as occurring too early. And it really didn't fully occur until after 1750. And then, of course, it reaches its apex in the 19th century, where you suddenly, finally have a system which has one center, which is the European center. Over all the rest of the world has been restructured to be subordinated to that center. That's the era of Eurocentrism and a Eurocentric structure. And historiography, knowledge, science, social theory became Eurocentric because they were written by the hegemons. And then we are now moving back into, and then we mapped the flows in a multi-centric system. You will see that in those centuries, China and India, Persia, other Asian regions were still very central and very significant, very rich, very powerful, very much attractive poles. Europe was part of the system and had incorporated the Americas under its domination and conquest into the system and used the bullion from that conquest to re-articulate their relationship with the rest of the Eurasian system. But they created a new global system. We all know this, and the colonial system. But we mapped out the routes. This is 94. There's the Indian Ocean routes, commodities and flows of bullion, and triangular relationships in the flows of the surplus or accumulated wealth, and then also some other maps there that showed gain a different way, and so on. So we did this sort of thing, and it can be done all the way through global history. These maps, as I say, Philippe Bujard has created them himself, going back millennia, and this is in a way revisionist history of the world economy. And right now, the hypothesis is that we are returning to in the post-Eurocentric era, post-European hegemony, or post the hegemony of the West, to a multi-centric system again, where you have more or less parity of many centers, and it's always been multi-civilizational, so it's again, it's non-hegemonic, multi-centric, and multi-civilizational. But it's also probably, we are entering a rivalry phase. And I talked about hegemony, rivalry. We are re-entering a rivalry phase. And rivalry phases are very fluid, open-ended, and unpredictable in many ways as to where they go, as it were. So the last part of the talk has to do with the paper in the Development Forum, which is about the global crisis, beyond the global crisis, and the failure of neoliberal economic globalization as the dominant global paradigm organizing development around the world. To something that is post-neoliberal. In that way, a different, a new paradigm of global development. But it requires overcoming the crisis in the immediate interim, and then realizing a new and radically different paradigm of global development. So I just proposed some ideas in that paper. It's a pure essay without a single reference in the essay, you will see. Which is unusual. I think it's the only piece I've ever published like that in my life. But it goes, the argument is that there are certain elements that you have to critique the sources of the global crisis and then address them by what I call a reverse course. And again, this is something that I don't think is news to anyone. There are a variety of de-globalization elements there to overturn the ideology of neoliberal economic globalization and revalidate the right to pursue principles and practices of development that depart from that dominant ideology. That's what I mean by de-globalization. So there are various other elements in it you'll see in the paper. Deconcentration, which is in a way sort of addressing the oligarchic structure of the world economy, that has been intensified by the neoliberal paradigm of globalization. But it also, deconcentration also means redistributing resources much more equitably both within and between countries. Another is decommodification, which involves revalidating the public sector's role in political economy, its useful role, and the duty of care by states to guarantee the livelihood and health of all of their people, strengthening the rights of labor everywhere to determine key decisions affecting their own lives, and enacting special measures globally to preserve biodiversity and prevent further destructive exploitation of natural resources and key ecosystems around the world. I put all of those under the rubric of the concept of decommodification reforms that would be needed for the reverse course to overcome the global crisis in the near term. There's also definancialization of capital, which implies a re-regulation of global capital movements, the implementation of global taxation on financial transactions, and a deprivatization, especially of particular kinds of natural resources and ecosystems, key industries, and key public utilities. And another one is de-authoritarianization, or you might call it re-democratization, which also involves devolution and decentralization of governance structures, strengthening of popular sovereignty, and the embedding of popular sovereignty into the new forms of global governance. and embedding cosmopolitan forms of social power and responsibility across all the levels from local to global levels. The other one is recommoning natural resources, especially those deemed most vulnerable to destruction, and in some cases even rewilding, in the sense of reestablishing or restoring key species and biodiversity for ecosystem health. The last bit of it is about convergence of global south and global north. That has been a long-standing aspiration, at least rhetorically, of the elite of the world. And many programs, including this the Sustainable Development Goals, are really about a global convergence. But that implies that there are certain areas of the world that, in a sense, have an excess affluence and excess wealth, and they can experience a kind of descaling, coming down a bit, reducing their consumption, changing their mode of existence, and then redistributing some of their wealth in a very proactive way to eliminate the extreme poverty, absolute poverty, in all the rest of the world, and also secure the transition to the post-fossil fuel energy economy. So that's part of its kind of a calibration. It's where part of the most advanced and wealthy parts of the world adjust and come down a bit, and the other parts are brought up by their direct assistance and wealth transfers and technical assistance. That's a well-known idea, but it's still not a fully realized program. The resources are not sufficient, and they need to be found and created. Reforms have to be put in place in order to make this global transfer of wealth, and it has to be done urgently, actually. I talk about this, the final challenge is that most of the population of the world for the first time now in world history lives in cities. But our urban mode of existence is part of a root of the problem of our global crisis in so many different ways. So in the future, I talk about at the end of the paper, kind of radical transformation of the urban sphere of life. And so you're kind of bringing in this self-sufficient localization, renewable energy, a whole kind of greening of the city. And there are some best practice cases around the world, and many people are talking about these ideas. In fact, Thomas Reuter, who showed us that last slide, is very much a visual of the kind of thing I'm talking about, where actually the rural sphere is also radically transformed by having all these new technologies there, employment there, income there, and the cities are also radically transformed. They both have to undergo this kind of radical transformation. That's another sort of convergence, which would really give us a new kind of world civilization. But I mean, I know that is very ambitious, but actually, I mean, I think if you don't propose the impossible, then you can't expect radical change. So thanks very much.